Yeah, as Hannah mentioned, I'm a retired sorghum breeder. Last 18 years, I worked in Mali until beginning of 2016. So what you will hear is actually a story that's maybe a little getting old, but I hope some of the things are continuing to happen and the learnings are certainly there. So I will be presenting just a little bit about the West Africa context, which I suppose most of you are familiar with, but just in case you want to get back at some of the basics, here's just some basic figures about the region, and the countries that I mostly worked in are Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And you probably know very well that these farming systems are very much dryland, rain-fed type systems based on sorghum and millet as the main staple crops, with all the problems that are easily associated with that, like very unpredictable rainfall, high variability, poor soil fertility, all kinds of biotic stresses, and thus repeated food insecurity and high vulnerability of the growing population. A severe issue is the very high levels of malnutrition and hidden hunger. Our breeding program for sorghum, thus, especially if you think about it as a participatory breeding program, thus can have very many goals. And it's clear that any breeding program has to have a kind of productivity and breeding efficiency related goal, which I put here at the bottom. And one could choose among many of these other goals to focus on for the justifying or for targeting nutrition participation. In our case, over those 18 years that myself and my husband ran the program, these have shifted somewhat. So farmer empowerment was always, I would say, a goal, and the conservation of biodiversity in the context of really conserving sorghum biodiversity, the local variability of the crop itself, were certainly always present. The role that nutrition or the role that support to women's group have played, this has changed over the course of the time, and you will be hearing some about those learnings and what that meant for the breeding program. I've put this presentation in the seed system context. Two reasons. In reading about your projects and learning a bit about the type of changes that your programs are trying to make at the higher production system level, it seemed to me the seed issues are missing. So, and I want to encourage you to maybe also look at that in more carefully. And mainly I'm saying this because I think that production system changes require, and those are changes here in the in this one, where's my cursor here? In the production and use function of any seed system. If you have changes in crop production, there will need to be changes in the other functions of the seed system. You may need different crops, you may need different varieties, and that way the other functions of the seed system will also adapt or change in one way or the other. And that way, looking at these functions and then looking at who can do what can always be useful. Today, in my presentation, we will largely look at this variety development function and only very briefly at the end at some of the other functions. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that identifying actors for participation in the variety development function requires knowing actors who can make changes in the other functions, because it's also clear if you want to have a successful breeding program that has chance to achieve any of those kind of impacts that we just discussed in the when we talked about goals, you cannot remain isolated and focus on your breeding. You need to have a clear idea on how the seed will reach your users. So it's really in this context that our work has always been in the context of understanding the seed systems as they operate and what is happening, and looking at what kind of changes then can be made to reach more people or reach other people or reach specific types of people. So what I will be presenting is in a way kind of iterative learning cycles around understanding seed systems and preferences, and understanding who does what also in terms of seed, and translating that into who can do what in terms of a breeding program. This brings me to the second circle or cycle and model that is more specific to breeding programs, and I don't expect you to be very familiar with all of this, but I just want to highlight that any breeding program has these kinds of 5 major steps. And what's mostly discussed as breeding research happens in these orange boxes. But any breeding program that wants to be successful has to have very well-defined objectives. Otherwise, these technical steps cannot be targeted well enough to actually contribute anything meaningful to the seed system. So as you will expect, or maybe I should say, tell you a little bit about the context on how we started the sorghum breeding program in Mali in 1998. It was after a very devastating impact assessment to ICRISAT, when it was found that the varieties that had been developed by the ICRISAT programs in West Africa were of no interest to farmers, and adoption was basically zero. And so, but there hadn't been, the impact assessment did not deliver good reasons for this poor adoption. So we had started some work with participatory research in India, and were asked, basically, can you go to Mali? Are you ready to go and change the program? But we don't know what needs to change. So our primary work initially was on this, setting these objectives, right, and understanding where can this program go. So you will hear a little bit about that stage in the first step. Our assumption about setting these priorities was that we need to understand who are the target people and in which kind of environments do they actually produce our crop, in this case, sorghum. And what are production systems where sorghum is important? What are other factors? Where are these systems going? What's the evolution? What do people do about seeds? Who is producing seed? And what are the practices? And then, of course, in this whole context, understand then what are possible needs of farmers, what are preferences, where can changes be made that are meaningful and that are giving advantages to people. Cutting this process short, and I should maybe, some key learnings from these initial analyses were that, and you will not be surprised, especially those of you who know northern Ghana, women are responsible to process staple food, and this is in this case sorghum, as food for the family. Men in these areas are responsible for providing the staple crop for the whole family, the whole year, which means in most cases 90% of grain production is consumed at home. So there is very little opportunity for marketing that grain. And the reality is, or at least it was, but I don't think it has actually changed fundamentally, is that a large proportion of families who live and work in the Sudan savanna of Mali, and this is similar for Burkina Faso or northern Ghana or Niger, are actually not food secure. So this 90% of what they produce is often not enough for their own consumption. So what is the first consequence for the breeding program is that any new variety that's of interest to farmers needs to be productive in the family fields, because these are the fields where men are responsible to grow this crop. And as people among you who know northern Ghana, it's probably similar that it's the men are, and usually it's the head of household, or more often the head of, in Mali they would say the head of labor use, responsible to organize, but everybody has to contribute labor to these fields. So this is a key important issue for the family. The other thing, of course, it has to be you have to be able to process that food into the grain into food that is edible, consumable, advantageous to the family, healthy and so forth. So what does this mean to the breeding program? For us, this meant we need to involve these heads of family and heads of labor in variety evaluations. And you will see a little bit in how we did this. We then also developed a method for village level cooking evaluations for assessing grain quality of these new varieties that were being tested, to make sure that they meet this criteria that women can produce, and it's preferred food for them. And we learned also as a outcome of this, you will see, to involve women actually in the evaluation of grain quality on station. Just a few of these type of results. These kinds of trials that were conducted by mostly heads of family. These were larger variety trials, usually 32 plots for each family who decided to conduct the trial, 4 of them in a village, served really for the breeding program a very immediate purpose of providing multi-location data, which is essential for assessing productivity. But these trials were managed by farmers. So they were directly in the target environment. And what I'm presenting to you here is a summary table as we used to present them to farmer groups. And all these trials were conducted by organizations of farmers, not coordinated by these organizations. Of course, they were in some individual farmers' field, but individual farmers conducted the trial on behalf of their organization. And so other people came to visit, and the results that they obtained were shared and discussed at yearly meetings. So this is one example of this kind of table. that is color, where the results are also color-coded. Everything that is red is worse than the mean. Everything that's white is one standard deviation better than the mean, and the pink ones are in between, just around the mean. So you can see that this is an earlier result. Our breeding trials weren't doing very well. Even yield-wise, we don't have many entries that are superior to the checks. You will see a similar table. This is just the visual appreciation of farmers. This is from a different trial. It looks like a little bit better. And actually what you can see here, all the ones that have those 3 stars are actually the hybrids. This was the first trial where we tested hybrids with farmers in these settings. And so some of them were very much appreciated, but not very significantly better, all of them. You can also see some of the differences between the materials that were being tested, some of the changes that breeding programs were trying to make. Here, it's actually focused on a different trait. You can see the height differences, of course, is phenomenal, but what we actually found out was that the digestibility of the stover, the stalks of sorghum, improved by 1% for every centimeter of internode length, and that's the length between where the leaves start here, by reduction in the internode length, so that the stalks of this type of variety would be very much better for animal feed than these really tall stalks that are very woody and can rather be used as firewood. Just as one example of the types of changes that the program was considering. I want to jump now to the evaluation of cooking quality, the culinary evaluations that we did. These are just some photos so you can imagine a little bit better on what happened, more to show you that it's a full procedure of cooking and evaluation at every step. But I will only flip through these slides to give you some impression and then show you some of the results that we obtained from these type of trials of evaluations. Maybe just to highlight here a visual, I think even visually you can see the difference, that the amount of bran here and here is vastly different. This is much less than here. And the amount of grain that was started out with was the same. So you will see more of these kinds of numbers in a minute. So this goes to the cooking stage and then the taste testing. Of every time 5 varieties in 3 replications, and that's in the end the big surprise. That everybody actually tested the same varieties but under different colors schemes, so they all do. And you can see there are some differences between how people cook. So sometimes the cooking changes the color a little bit. So it's good to have replication. Let's start with the first step of this kind of evaluation, which is looking at visually at the grains and getting women's feedback. And you can see here already that women actually used 6 different kind of criteria to look at when they look at grain visually. It's the size, it's this is one of the diseases that you can see on the grain, whether how many broken grains are there glooms among the grain, have the grains been attacked by insect, and of course what's the color of the grain. And all this gets lumped into one overall appreciation. And you can see that those 5 varieties here actually, for some of those traits, differed dramatically, which led to, in the end, like this one variety that from our point of view, from productivity and other traits, was a very interesting variety, but already visually you can see almost no appreciation overall. So a variety like that will never go far. If you talk to the breeder, he would have pushed this alone. This brown variety you will come across more often, Tiblet. It's become a very long-term check in many trials because it combines good traits for so many things, and including the grain qualities. This guana variety looks really good here, and we were really excited about it, but it also actually never went very far. And I think mostly because it didn't thresh easily. As you can see here, there are many glooms. And right there, you see weaknesses. And if you have a variety that has serious weaknesses, even if it's just one thing, it may cause its downfall. So this much, what we learned from this exercise, doing these kinds of evaluations with women in the villages, this comes from village level evaluations, is that these assessments that women do on this are so clear, and they are to them so obvious, that we decided to actually invite women who have good experience in doing that to the research station and look at grain samples from our station observations, just small plots, to help us get rid of things that are not going to go far. This is the other graph that I want to show you and explain a little bit about. You can see here the different length of the columns. One column, each column is a variety, and the taller the column, the more losses are there from during decortication in the preparation of the grain for cooking. So the more losses of dry matter the cook experiences. So it's clear that people don't want varieties where you lose 30% of your dry matter by just taking the seed coat off. And you can see here the L's are some local varieties that people had put into those trials as their local checks. And this is probably the worst of the locals. So absolutely a variety that you want to get good adoption of should really be around below 20% of losses. And yeah, this has been fairly much clear like that the varieties that were being adopted were in this range for decortication losses. And we found in this way that many of the varieties that our predecessors had developed that were not being adopted had losses up to 40%. So it's very clear these kind of varieties cannot be adopted. And this came out from, of course, straight interaction with women and following the process and measuring what we could measure about what they were doing. These kinds of discussions then led us to develop with them the concept of food yield. And it was really the discussion with some farmers after we had done this lengthy process for 2 days, because we also needed to evaluate the quality of this tow the next morning, because people like to warm it up in the morning, and if it doesn't stay stiff overnight, again, it's no good. So we discussed with farmer after a long day of trying to do this, whether it was useful for him to do this long cooking evaluation. And in the end said, yeah, okay, but really what matters is just how much food he can get from the grain that he produces. And this is what we have now, what we are calling food yield. It is really how much meals can you prepare from your labor in 1 hectare or in your sorghum field for one season. And it came out in these discussions that a lot of trades contribute to that. So it's already starts during the harvest or pre-harvest period in the you don't want losses during harvest or transport, so no shattering of the grain. You want easy threshing, so you don't have glooms in the grain. So the glooms need to be wide open. You want low decortication losses. We just looked at that. We want easy decortication, so the grains don't jump out of the mortar when you're pounding it. There needs to be often a balance of hard and soft endosperm. That depends a bit on the kind of dishes you want to prepare. But you also want good water absorption, so you get a good volume of your porridge in the end. And really important, reduced losses during grain storage. And interestingly, a lot of that is related again to hard grain and also to no moldiness on the grain, which are actually traits related to some of the other components that we had just discussed. So these discussions gave us a lot of things to work on, and it's very clear, again, lesson, varieties with grain that cannot be prepared efficiently cannot be adopted. So, and this hasn't even done, there's not even any consideration of food nutritional quality in there, which we actually managed to add afterwards, but I will not have time today to talk about that. So let's go another round of learning. Again, just looking at cropping system changes, and I think these may be some of the things that you are looking at. In the environments where we were working, maize is becoming a more important staple crop, and many men are focusing on it because they experience higher levels of food security. This is a lot of it related to having cotton in the rotation and being able to buy fertilizer when they grow cotton. It has as a consequence, or it seems related to the fact that many women are growing more sorghum in their own fields. When in their own fields, they mostly grow legume crops because their own fields are usually not part of the cotton maize sorghum rotation in the family fields, or they come at the very end of these rotations when there is no more soil fertility left, or when there's no fertilizer left. So you cannot grow maize in those women fields, but women want to have the sorghum because of food security needs of their own children and for being able to sell something right away, and that's easy to store. So what does that mean for breeding? New varieties need to be actually adapted to this wide range of fields. Some varieties, some crops are grown in these rotations, some crops are grown outside of these rotations, and they need to be new varieties, if women should benefit, need to be adapted to this intercropping with the legume crops. So what happened when we started doing that? The sorghum breeding program ensured that women conduct actually their own sorghum variety trials. And we tried to do this as small women groups on a village basis. We then adapted, so they could do that, we adapted our trial protocols so that the varieties could be tested as intercrops with groundnut. And we started monitoring soil fertility because it seemed quite clear that there are huge differences in field management. And we continued this focus on improving local germplasm. Just a quick word on how this trial organization panned out. For women, it was usually only 3 varieties because, of course, the trial takes more space if you have intercropped, and so then you have much bigger inter-row spacing. So the other thing we decided to do, and this was really based on farmer request, is to split the variety plots into 2 halves. As you can see here, one part was fertilized, local practice, whatever people did. And then the other part, they received some additional fertilizer to put some as basal dose, the DAP, and then 50 kilos of urea for some top dressing later at early booting stage. What we evaluated here are 188 of these trials in 3 zones. You can read by yourself. So a total of 1,600 plots were a part of this database. A total of 50 varieties were tested in this system for over the 2-year period in 3 regions of Mali. And you can see here that they are pretty much in one agroecology. This is the Mande region, this is the Joela region, and this is the Kuchala region. And these dots are the cooperatives with whom we worked. So you can see that there's many organizations that participated in this. I'm just giving you here one of the kind of results from this type of trial so you get some impression of gender differences. And what you can see here, interestingly, in these trials, the women actually on average managed to get higher yields than the men. What is the reason? Probably the women were so keen that they could get access to these trials, they actually managed the trials better or put more effort into their trials. If we looked at soil fertility, the picture is very different. Soil fertility levels for phosphorus, and this is mostly what is really limiting in these environments. And when you know a little bit about phosphorus, usually 10 Bray-P, sometimes a bit lower, is considered adequate. If you consider that the threshold of 10, you can see that basically no women's fields actually is even considered remotely adequate. But also among the men's fields, only very few are a little bit better. So phosphorus availability is a huge issue, but as you can see here, it is way worse for women fields than for men fields. So what was the consequences for our breeding program? We first learned from the women trials that they really do like tall sorghum varieties better for intercropping because they sway in the wind and that way don't shade the groundnut so permanently. They also prefer earlier varieties because they often sow them much later, and also they want often to harvest the groundnuts early, and that way the sorghum may get disturbed. There's also preference for a specific type of panicles, and it's clear we need to have varieties that are adapted to this low P availability. We then started to study actually what happens to sorghum with and without phosphorus in these kind of environments. And these are just 2 comparisons that we were actually quite surprised to learn about. And it's, I think, really important to consider in a lot of planning and thinking and modeling of crop production. There are varieties of sorghum. When you plant them under low phosphorus conditions, they will flower 21 days later than if they are planted with sufficient phosphorus available. This, of course, expresses also on plant height, and you can see here that some varieties they may produce, but they may be just a half a meter tall, whereas when they have phosphorus, the same variety will grow 2.5 or 3 meters tall. So the effect of the phosphorus not an unavailability, is tremendous. And the varietal differences in response are also quite astounding. Here you see yield responses, and each line is a variety over a set of growing trial conditions with different levels of P availability, which is here on the x-axis. So you can see this blue line here is one local variety from actually northern Cameroon with very high yields under the highest yields under low, under basically very poor phosphorus availability. Whereas some of the bred lines, like the red line here, is giving the highest yields under very high phosphorus availability, but that same variety really plummets under poor P conditions. So in a more normal breeding trial, this red line would be selected because it's giving you the highest yield under usually every research station is on this kind of condition. You will be selecting for this kind of variety, but in a farmer's field, this is more common. So this variety will not show superiority. It will rather provide actually increased risk to small-scale farmers who cannot produce with fertilizer. So it's really important to understand how your varieties are behaving in response to phosphorus. And in terms of our selection strategy, then it became really critical that we say our new varieties have to be at least as good and hopefully better under poor soil fertility conditions, that this is more important, this superiority, for releasing varieties to these kinds of farmers than to select for this kind of superiority. But this is, of course, requires a very different types of trial management and a different type of selection strategy. So that much about soil management and crop management. Just a little bit about seed management, and I think we're running short of time. So I'll try and go very quick. You may know some of these things, that a good farmer in West Africa, especially sorghum people, keep their own seed and they exchange usually not for more than 1-to-1. And farmers keep several varieties, and very often women depend on their husbands for seed, which really changed due to these on-farm trials. In this situation, when there's actually very little commercial value for seed, we found it's the most important way to move forward with seed production is to have it as a group activity and as a group business, so that the whole village or more can benefit from seed production. And this resulted that way in, this is just one example for one of the bigger cooperatives who started to organize itself into different, this is a union of cooperatives, so each circle is a cooperative, and they started committees on community basis to coordinate all of their seed efforts. And these kinds of union of cooperatives, just to give you a bit overview, they are producing probably 80 or 90% of certified seed in the meantime in all of these countries, Mali, Burkina, and Niger. Private companies are buying their seed and they may be selling some of it, but they're not producing anything. So we looked at seed business models, and we can discuss this if you like. Selling seed, excuse me, was not actually practiced. There was no specific seed sales. So once people had identified these new varieties through these trials, there was discussion on how this could be done. And one trial was to actually sell these mini packs of 100 grams and sell them at with at a cost in this case was 100 CFA, which actually for the seed, if it was for the grain value, it would have been expensive, but people thought 100 CFA that everybody can have, it's easy, it's not too much. So in this experimental sale over 2 years, there was quite a good sale in just in one place. And we monitored adoption 2 years later, and we found that some 50% of people actually kept seed for the next year. And of those who kept the seed, about almost 80% increased the area in the following year. They almost all received seed requests from others, and about 30% managed to give seed to others. So that from just selling these 100-gram packets of varieties that were with description, where they knew that other people had tested them in their area, adoption was actually happening. So we monitored that and looked at whether diversity on a farmer level changed. And I'm sorry, I don't think I have a time to explain all of this, but all the arrows that go to the right show that farmers increase the number of varieties that they grow. And you can see that most of the arrows go to the right, so that there is increase of diversity on a family level among the varieties that they grow. These seed sales this mini pack sale worked very well and got a lot of these cooperatives started with seed sale, but now they're all selling much bigger packs, and even to this point of selling 20-kilo bags or 10-kilo bags. But most of the bags are now like a kilo or two. So still much smaller than what you would think from, thinking about a Western experience. And these are some of the observations and discussions around seed businesses that we've had over time. But I think I'll leave this maybe open for discussion later on. And I wanted to just close by saying that changes that a breeding program can make in response to learning about gender and learning about land management in general is that it's important to actually, you can include reducing the gender gap or strengthening women as a goal into your program. You can focus, of course, the type of variety you want to develop and who are your target users maybe, and that way is criteria. I want to really highlight the type of collaboration. We found this way of working with groups and having a continuous learning cycles as really a super important basis for making progress together. So I want to leave some time for discussion. Sorry for rushing through this.